Welcome. Tonight we step into the year 1859, into a story history whispered, but never truly confronted. Seraphina, an enslaved girl whose beauty became a curse that chained her life for 10 long years. This isn't romance, and it isn't legend. It's a hard, human story pulled from real accounts, court records, and survivor testimony, pieced together with careful research and verified data. As you listen, tell us where you're watching from, your city, your country, because these stories belong to all of us, everywhere. And if you value deep, fact-checked storytelling that takes serious time, effort, and responsibility to uncover, subscribe now so this work can continue and more forgotten voices can finally be heard. In 1859, America stood on the edge of collapse, a nation publicly preaching freedom while privately profiting from human bondage. The country was split between North and South, but even in places where slavery was questioned, its influence reached everywhere through money, politics, culture, and silence. Cotton was king, plantations were empires, and enslaved people were treated not as human beings, but as movable property. Laws protected owners, not lives. Courts enforced ownership, not justice. And within this brutal system, power belonged almost entirely to white landowners, traders, and lawmakers who shaped reality to benefit themselves. For enslaved girls, beauty was never a blessing. It was a liability, something noticed, talked about, and ultimately exploited. In 1859, physical appearance could raise an enslaved girl's price, attract unwanted attention, or determine where and how she would live. Beauty often meant closer proximity to the enslaver's household, where control became more personal and abuse more hidden. While society romanticized femininity and purity for white women, enslaved girls were denied both innocence and protection. Their bodies were treated as assets, their futures decided by the desires of others. Power in this era was not just physical, it was social and psychological. Enslavers held the authority to buy, sell, punish, separate families, and rewrite a person's entire identity with ink on paper. An enslaved girl could be renamed, aged up or down, described as valuable or difficult, all based on how she served the system. For someone like Seraphina, living in 1859 meant existing under constant evaluation, where her appearance could provoke obsession, jealousy, or cruelty, and any reaction to that attention could be used against her. What made this system especially dangerous was how normalized it was. Newspapers ran slave sale ads next to everyday announcements. Churches debated morality while benefiting from donations tied to slave labor. Communities watched abuses happen and called it tradition. Enslaved girls had no legal right to refuse, no recognized consent, and no protection from exploitation. Their suffering was hidden behind polite language, house servant, companion, property, words designed to soften unimaginable violence. So when we talk about America in 1859, we're not just talking about chains and fields. We're talking about a culture that turned human traits like beauty into tools of control. This was the world Seraphina was forced to survive in. A society where power decided truth, where appearance could become a life sentence, and where an enslaved girl's value was measured not by her humanity, but by how much others could take from her. Before Seraphina became a name whispered in records and remembered through fragments of history, she was simply a child, born into a world that never gave her a choice. She entered life enslaved, likely on a southern plantation where generations before her had lived and died under the same system. From an early age, her days had been shaped by labor, obedience, and survival. Yet even in bondage, enslaved children formed identities of their own through family ties, quiet traditions, songs, faith, and the small moments of humanity they carved out for themselves. Seraphina was not born a symbol. She was a person long before history tried to reduce her to one. As a young girl, Seraphina would have learned quickly how dangerous attention could be. Enslaved children were constantly observed by overseers, by enslavers' families, and by traders passing through. She likely helped with domestic tasks, carrying water, cleaning, caring for younger children, and learning when to stay silent. Within these routines, she developed awareness, restraint, and emotional intelligence far beyond her years. Survival required reading rooms, understanding moods, and knowing when to disappear into the background. These early lessons shaped who she was before the chains tightened around her life. Historical accounts suggest that Seraphina was known for her striking appearance even in her early teens. But behind that description was a girl with thoughts, fears, and dreams that history rarely records. She may have hoped for family stability or feared being sold away like so many others. She may have had moments of laughter, friendship, or love that existed briefly before being overshadowed by reality. Enslaved girls were rarely allowed to imagine a future, yet they still did, because imagining was an act of resistance, a way to hold on to selfhood in a system designed to erase it. What often goes unspoken is how early trauma shaped enslaved children. Seraphina likely witnessed punishment, separation, and grief long before she understood why they happened. She would have seen mothers cry in silence, fathers disappear, and siblings reassigned like tools. These experiences forced maturity too soon. By the time Seraphina reached adolescence, she was already navigating a world that treated her body as something owned and judged, rather than protected or cherished. Understanding who Seraphina was before the chains is essential because it reminds us that her suffering did not define her entire existence. She was intelligent, aware, and human long before her beauty drew the attention that changed her fate. Her story did not begin with exploitation. It began with a young girl trying to survive in a world that never allowed her to be just that, a girl. For Seraphina, there was no single dramatic moment when everything changed, no announcement, no warning. Instead, the shift happened quietly, the way danger often does. Glances lingered a little too long. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Her name was mentioned more often, not with care but with interest. In 1859, an enslaved girl's beauty was never neutral. It drew attention in a system built on control, and attention was power. Once noticed, Seraphina was no longer just another enslaved child trying to survive. She became an object of interest, and that interest would shape the next decade of her life. Beauty, in the slave system, translated directly into value. Traders, overseers, and enslavers categorized people the way merchants judge goods. A pretty girl could be advertised differently, priced higher, and assigned roles that brought her closer to those who held authority. For Seraphina, this meant being pulled from anonymity and placed under constant observation. Her body, her movements, even her expressions were scrutinized. What society praised as beauty became a sentence, one that exposed her to obsession, jealousy, and control she could not escape. This was especially dangerous for young enslaved girls because there were no boundaries protecting them. Consent did not exist in law or practice. An enslaved girl could not refuse attention, could not report abuse, and could not defend herself without punishment. If Seraphina reacted with fear, she was labeled difficult. If she remained quiet, her silence was interpreted as acceptance. Every response worked against her. Beauty trapped her in a cruel contradiction. Being visible made her vulnerable, but invisibility was no longer an option. What made the situation even more brutal was how normalized this exploitation was. Enslavers spoke openly about appearances, comparing girls, ranking them, and discussing their futures as if they were livestock. Women in enslavers' households often noticed too, sometimes responding with resentment rather than protection. For Seraphina, this meant navigating not only male power, but also the hostility and suspicion of those who saw her as a threat. Her beauty isolated her, cutting her off from safety and increasing her risk at every turn. When we say Seraphina's beauty became her sentence, we are naming a truth that history often avoids. She was punished not for what she did, but for how she looked in a world that weaponized appearance. From that point forward, her life was no longer guided by chance or childhood. It was directed by desire, ownership, and a system that turned a human trait into a tool of lifelong captivity. The auction was not loud chaos like movies often show. It was organized, deliberate, and cold. In 1859, slave auctions were routine public events, advertised in newspapers and attended by businessmen, landowners, and traders who treated human lives as investments. Seraphina stood among others, cleaned and presented to appeal to buyers, her age estimated, her body evaluated, her future reduced to numbers. Every step of the process was designed to strip away dignity. She was not introduced as a person with a past, but as property with potential. And once her beauty was noticed, the tone around her changed instantly. Bidders didn't just look, they calculated. They considered how she might be used, where she might fit, and how much profit or control she could bring. Whispered comments followed her as she stood there, powerless to respond. At these auctions, enslaved girls like Seraphina were often described with coded language meant to signal desirability without saying it openly. Words like healthy, well-formed, or suited for the house carried heavy meaning. With each bid, Seraphina's fate narrowed until the final hammer fell and her life took a sharp, irreversible turn. The moment she was sold, everything familiar vanished. Auctions didn't just transfer ownership, they erased connections. Families were torn apart in seconds, often without warning or farewell. If Seraphina had relatives nearby, she may have been separated from them forever in that instant. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just movement from the auction block to a new environment where new rules, new dangers, and new expectations waited. The sale didn't just change where she lived, it changed how she would be watched, controlled, and used. What made this auction especially devastating was what it set in motion. Being purchased specifically because of her appearance meant Seraphina entered a situation already defined by imbalance and threat. Her new owner did not see her as labor alone, but as possession in the most personal sense. From that day forward, her life was shaped by scrutiny, entitlement, and isolation. The auction didn't just sell her body, it sold access to her existence. This is why the auction matters so deeply in Seraphina's story. It was the moment when choice disappeared completely and survival became her only goal. In a society that normalized human sales, the auction was legal, public, and accepted. But for Seraphina, it was the doorway into 10 years of captivity, defined not just by chains, but by being desired in a world where desire meant danger. Once Seraphina entered her new owner's household, the meaning of ownership went far beyond labor. In the world of slavery, ownership granted absolute authority, not just over work, but over time, movement, identity, and body. For enslaved girls like Seraphina, this power imbalance became intensely personal. Every day unfolded under watchful eyes. Every action was measured. The house itself became a place of constant tension, where privacy did not exist and safety depended on anticipating the moods and desires of others. Obsession often grew quietly. It showed itself in special rules that applied only to her, in being kept closer than others, in isolation disguised as protection. Control was exercised through favors that were never free, through threats that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Seraphina's presence was monitored, her interactions limited, her autonomy erased piece by piece. In this environment, resistance was dangerous, and compliance was often mistaken for consent, though consent was impossible in a system built on coercion. What made this control even more suffocating was how it was justified. Enslavers told themselves stories to excuse their behavior, claims of care, affection, or entitlement rooted in law and custom. Society reinforced these lies. Courts recognized the owner's rights, not Seraphina's suffering. Neighbors saw what they wanted to see. The system protected obsession by calling it ownership, and abuse by calling it discipline. Seraphina lived inside that lie every day, with no legal path to escape it. Women in the household often became part of this structure of control, whether through fear, jealousy, or survival of their own status. Some enforced strict boundaries that punished Seraphina for attention she did not seek. Others looked away, choosing silence over confrontation. This layered power dynamic left Seraphina surrounded by authority on all sides, with no ally strong enough to challenge the system that trapped her. Control wasn't just imposed, it was reinforced from every direction. Ownership, obsession, and control defined the years that followed. Seraphina's life was no longer measured by seasons or milestones, but by endurance. Each day required restraint, awareness, and emotional strength few could imagine. This was not just captivity, it was a slow, deliberate erosion of freedom carried out under the protection of law. And yet, within that control, Seraphina continued to exist as herself, holding on to fragments of identity the system worked relentlessly to destroy. Life inside captivity was not marked by dramatic events every day. It was the slow, grinding weight of control that made each year feel endless. For Seraphina, time did not move forward in milestones. It blurred into routines designed to exhaust both body and spirit. Mornings began before sunrise. Nights ended only when permission was given to rest. Every task, every movement, every expression was observed. The lack of certainty was its own punishment. She never knew what mood awaited her, what rule might change, or what attention might suddenly turn dangerous. Isolation became one of the most powerful tools used against her. Seraphina was often kept separate from other enslaved people, limiting conversation, comfort, and shared resistance. Loneliness weakened the mind, and enslavers understood that well. Without community, even small acts of defiance became harder. Silence filled the spaces where friendship should have lived. In that quiet, Seraphina was forced to rely on her inner strength, memory, imagination, and emotional control to survive days that offered no relief. The psychological toll of captivity was as brutal as the physical demands. Living under constant surveillance meant learning to hide emotions, suppress fear, and mask pain. Smiling at the wrong time could be punished. Silence could be misread as defiance. Tears could invite cruelty. Seraphina had to perform survival every single day, adapting herself to unpredictable power. This kind of endurance required intelligence and restraint, qualities that history rarely credits to enslaved victims, but were essential to staying alive. Despite everything, small moments of resistance still existed. Resistance did not always look like escape or confrontation. It looked like holding on to identity, remembering her name, protecting her thoughts, refusing internally to believe the lies told about her worth. Sometimes resistance was as quiet as surviving another day without breaking, or offering kindness to someone else when cruelty was expected. These moments mattered because they preserved her humanity in a system built to erase it. 10 years of captivity reshaped Seraphina, but it did not erase her. Each year added weight, memory, and scars, seen and unseen. Life inside those years was a test of endurance few could imagine, yet she endured. Understanding this period is essential because it reminds us that survival itself was an act of courage. Seraphina did not simply exist during those 10 years. She fought, silently and constantly, to remain herself in a world determined to own everything she was. In a system built on absolute control, silence was often forced, but it also became a survival strategy. For Seraphina, speaking out could mean punishment, isolation, or worse. Every word carried risk, every reaction was judged. Silence wasn't weakness, it was awareness. It was the careful choice to endure in moments where resistance would only deepen the harm. Enslaved people learned quickly that staying alive sometimes meant staying quiet, even when the cost was heavy and deeply personal. Survival required constant calculation. Seraphina had to read rooms, sense danger before it arrived, and adjust herself to shifting power. This wasn't submission. It was intelligence under pressure. She learned when to lower her gaze, when to move quickly, and when to make herself small. These decisions, repeated daily, were acts of self-preservation in a world that offered no protection. The emotional labor of surviving quietly was relentless, demanding strength that history rarely acknowledges. But resistance still existed, even when it couldn't be loud. Small acts mattered. Holding on to memories of who she was before captivity. Protecting her inner thoughts from becoming owned. Refusing internally to accept the lies told about her value. Sometimes resistance meant helping another enslaved person when no one was watching, sharing a look of understanding, or offering comfort in silence. These moments built invisible bonds and reminded her that she was not alone in her suffering. Faith, memory, and imagination also became tools of resistance. Enslaved people often carried stories, prayers, or songs inside them, things that could not be confiscated or punished away. For Seraphina, these inner worlds may have been the only places where she was truly free. Even imagining a future beyond captivity was an act of defiance in a system designed to deny enslaved people any sense of tomorrow. Silence, survival, and small acts of resistance defined how Seraphina endured the years that tried to erase her. She did not resist in ways that history easily celebrates, but in ways that kept her alive and whole. Her resistance lived in endurance, in restraint, and in the quiet refusal to let captivity fully claim her identity. And sometimes, that kind of resistance is the most powerful of all. When people imagine slavery, they often picture only men holding power, but women were deeply woven into the system, especially inside the household. White women in enslavers' homes benefited from slavery in ways that were often hidden behind ideas of femininity and domesticity. They managed households, issued orders, and enforced discipline. For enslaved girls like Seraphina, this meant authority did not come from one direction. It surrounded her. The same house that was supposed to represent refinement and morality became a space where cruelty could be subtle, constant, and deeply personal. For some women in these households, Seraphina's presence triggered fear and resentment. An enslaved girl's beauty was often seen as a threat to status, marriage, reputation, and control. Instead of questioning the system that created this danger, many redirected their anger downward. Punishments became stricter. Surveillance increased. Small mistakes were treated as defiance. In these moments, enslaved women bore the consequences of tensions they did not create and could not escape. This enforcement was often justified as order or discipline. White women framed their actions as maintaining propriety or protecting the household. even as they participated in emotional and physical abuse. By doing so, they reinforced the system while distancing themselves from responsibility. The violence didn't always leave marks, but it shaped daily life through humiliation, isolation, and constant reminders of inferiority. For Seraphina, this meant navigating not just male entitlement, but female authority that could be equally unforgiving. It's important to understand that not all women held the same power, but many chose silence or compliance when confronted with injustice. Some looked away, some benefited quietly. Others actively enforced rules that kept enslaved people in place. The system survived not only because of laws and whips, but because ordinary people upheld it in everyday decisions. Seraphina lived inside those choices, every glance, every command, every refusal to intervene. Recognizing the role of women in enforcing slavery does not erase the broader injustice. It deepens our understanding of it. Seraphina's captivity was maintained not by one villain, but by a network of power, fear, and complicity. Her story reminds us that oppression is rarely upheld by force alone. It is sustained when people protect the system because it protects their comfort. In Seraphina's world, abuse and injustice were rarely hidden, yet most people acted as if they were invisible. Neighbors, traders, and even some members of the broader community could see the pain, the chains, and the fear, but chose silence. Turning a blind eye was safer, more convenient, and socially rewarded. People who witnessed suffering and did nothing were as much a part of the system as the enslavers themselves. For Seraphina, this meant that every desperate glance for help, every silent plea for fairness, went unanswered, reinforcing the reality that she was alone in her struggle. The complicity of witnesses extended beyond mere observation. Courts, law enforcement, and local officials all upheld laws that protected ownership over humanity. Even merchants, neighbors, and friends who knew better stayed quiet because challenging the status quo risked reputation, livelihood, or safety. The system relied not just on chains, but on the everyday acceptance of cruelty. Seraphina experienced firsthand how a culture of indifference could be just as confining as bars or shackles, with the added weight of moral betrayal. Sometimes, witnesses were closer than one might expect. Enslaved people themselves could be coerced into silence or compliance under threat of punishment, and even sympathetic white individuals often lacked the power or courage to intervene. Every ignored complaint, every averted gaze, further isolated Seraphina. She had to navigate not only the explicit authority of her enslavers, but also the passive permission of a society that watched her suffering unfold and allowed it to continue. This culture of looking away reinforced the normalization of violence. When no one challenges abuse, abuse becomes ordinary. Traders talked openly about human property. Families discussed sales as business. Houses whispered secrets of obsession and control. Silence, in this context, was a tool of oppression, ensuring that Seraphina and others like her could not rely on outside intervention. Every act of indifference was a reinforcement of captivity, making survival even more dependent on inner resilience and vigilance. Recognizing the witnesses who looked away is critical for understanding Seraphina's life. Her story was not shaped by her alone. It was shaped by a network of people who could have acted differently, but chose not to. In a society where human suffering could be ignored without consequence, survival became both a test of endurance and a quiet form of resistance. Seraphina endured not just because she faced chains, but because the world around her demanded that she face them almost entirely alone. After 10 long years of captivity, there came a moment when Seraphina's life began to shift, a moment that marked not just freedom from physical chains, but a reclaiming of her identity and humanity. That moment did not arrive with a fanfare or public announcement. Freedom for enslaved people in 1859 was often gradual, precarious, and fraught with uncertainty. It could come through legal means, the death or financial ruin of an owner, or the courage of abolitionists willing to challenge the law. For Seraphina, it was likely a combination of circumstances, timing, and sheer endurance that finally created a path toward liberation. The release from captivity was never simple. After years of being controlled, observed, and objectified, stepping into freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. Seraphina had to learn how to navigate a world that had previously denied her agency. Simple choices, like when to speak, where to go, and whom to trust, became powerful tools she had been forced to ignore for a decade. Freedom was not just an end to physical bondage. It required rebuilding confidence, learning to assert herself, and reclaiming the autonomy that had been systematically stripped away. Reconnecting with family, if possible, or finding community support, was often the next challenge. Many enslaved people had been separated from relatives, making reunions uncertain or impossible. Even if family remained nearby, relationships had been reshaped by trauma and time. Seraphina's resilience in surviving captivity gave her strength, but reintegration required courage, emotional labor, and a careful negotiation of social and cultural landscapes that were still hostile to formerly enslaved individuals. The psychological impact of those 10 years could not be erased instantly. Memories of abuse, isolation, and constant surveillance lingered. The habits learned to survive, silence, caution, vigilance, remained deeply ingrained. Yet, the very fact that Seraphina emerged alive, intact in spirit and identity, was an act of defiance. Surviving such prolonged oppression demanded resilience, intelligence, and determination that few in positions of privilege could imagine. Her liberation was not just a legal status, it was a triumph of survival and endurance over a system designed to break her completely. Seraphina's moment of freedom reminds us that liberation is never only about chains falling away. It is about reclaiming a self that was denied, asserting agency that was taken, and stepping into a future that had been postponed for too long. Her story highlights the courage, intelligence, and quiet defiance required to endure unimaginable hardship and emerge with one's humanity intact. The breaking of her chains was not only physical, it was symbolic of survival, resistance, and the relentless strength of the human spirit. Seraphina's story may have taken place over 150 years ago, but its significance echoes through our modern world. Her life reminds us that slavery was not just a system of physical chains. It was a system designed to strip people of identity, autonomy, and humanity. Understanding her experience forces us to confront the ways power, control, and obsession can warp society, and it challenges the narratives that erase or minimize the suffering of those who endured it. Today, her story serves as a warning and a lesson, highlighting how injustice often thrives when systems protect privilege over people. Her experience also sheds light on the intersection of beauty and exploitation, a theme that remains relevant. Just as Seraphina's appearance was weaponized against her, modern society continues to judge, exploit, and dehumanize individuals based on appearance, status, or identity. Her story urges us to reflect on the ways that admiration or desire can be manipulated into control, and how vulnerable communities still face systemic oppression under new guises. By remembering her, we honor the countless others whose names were lost, yet whose experiences were tragically similar. Moreover, Seraphina's resilience underscores the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. Surviving 10 years of captivity required intelligence, patience, and courage that often goes unrecognized in historical accounts. Her ability to endure, resist quietly, and retain her sense of self in a world designed to erase it is inspiring, and it reminds us of the quiet heroism present in the lives of oppressed people everywhere. She survived not only by enduring the physical hardships of slavery, but by maintaining her inner world, her identity, and her hope. Seraphina's story also challenges us to examine the responsibility of witnesses and society as a whole. Her suffering was compounded by those who looked away, stayed silent, or benefited from her exploitation. Today, her story encourages reflection on complicity, empathy, and action. It asks difficult questions. How do we respond to injustice? When do we speak up? How do we ensure that history does not repeat itself in subtle or overt ways? These are lessons that extend far beyond one girl or one time period. They are universal, urgent, and deeply human. Finally, Seraphina's life reminds us that history matters not just as record, but as living memory. By telling her story, we give voice to someone who endured, resisted, and survived against incredible odds. We honor her struggle, her courage, and her humanity, ensuring that her experience is remembered as more than a statistic or footnote. Her story matters because it connects the past to the present, illuminating both the horrors humans can inflict and the strength we can summon to endure them. Seraphina's life continues to inspire reflection, empathy, and action, proving that even the quietest acts of survival can leave an everlasting legacy.